Welcome to another series of lectures from CEC Gurukul. Today we would be discussing the case of universal shift register and will begin with counters. As we have understood thus far by studying the shift registers which originate from a collection of flip-flops, that the shift registers store data. And now there are two ways how to shift data into a register and also access data out of the register. The modes are serial and parallel. This leads to the construction of four types of basic registers. Number one is the serial data input and serial data output. The acronym for this is SISO. We call them as CISO. The second one is the serial data input and parallel output. Acronym for this is SIPO. Third one is the parallel data input and serial data output, known as the PISO. And finally, the parallel data input and parallel data output, that is with an acronym called PIPO. Now common sense says, thus far we have studied the transmission of serial data and parallel data. And common sense tells us that of course we need to have a device that should be fast, but at the same time, since it's a digital device, so it should be at a lower price. So depending upon applications that we have, we consider our priorities, whether it is the fast data transaction is required or a slow data at a cheaper price can work for it. Therefore, we can just look at these block diagrams and understand that CISO would be the slowest and PIPO, parallel in, parallel out, would be the fastest. But with PIPO, the problem is that since it is the fastest, hence it requires precision amplifiers to work with it, and therefore the whole package becomes costlier. CISO, on the other hand, would have minimal circuitry involved, and therefore it being the slowest would also be the cheapest. The intermediates, that is the CIPO and PISO, work out in between. So depending on applications, we prefer or rather choose which shift register to use. Now, since it is a digital device, hence as clients we would not want different devices for different rates of data transfer and different circuitry. So hence the industry decided to make a universal shift register which can be used for serial data input, serial data output, serial input, parallel output, parallel input, serial output, and finally parallel input and parallel output. So depending on the choice made by common persons like us, depending on the applications, we can configure this universal shift register as CISO or CIPO or PISO or PIPO. But before we move to universal shift register, we need to understand how the serial input works. So hence in the next slide we would be looking at the serial input, serial output and serial input, parallel output circuit. So as we can see, in this case we have the JK master slave configured flip-flop. As we know from our previous study, we can see that JK flip-flop has a problem with toggling, and hence it is always used in the master slave configuration to prevent what is known as the race around condition. So in this case, looking at the circuit, we can easily see that it is a 4-bit data that we are going to transfer into the shift register and then access them in serial mode as well as parallel mode. So just looking at the circuit diagram, we can see that there is a NOT gate fixed. So hence the value of J and K would never be the same. That is, J and K in all the flip-flops will never have the same value, since initially when the data is being fed, then J and K have a NOT gate in between. We also have a clock, and with our previous classes we have studied the symbols. So in this case, we have a negative edge triggered clock that is in place. We have a clear line that is connected to all the flip-flops, and we see it is in active low configuration. Also, we have a preset, and that preset is joined to all the flip-flops so that we are able to feed in data into the flip-flop. So initially what we will do is that we will keep the clear as 0 and preset equal to 1. So looking at the circuit, we find that the outputs of all the flip-flops, that is Q3, Q2, Q1 and Q0, comes out to be 0, 0, 0, 0. That is because we have kept the preset as equal to 1, and also we see a bubble in front of the presets of all the flip-flops. Hence, when we keep preset as equal to 1, we have the inputs as complement of 1, that is 0, 0, 0, 0. Also, the clear, we have written the clear as equal to 0, and it being active low, therefore the outputs of all the flip-flops are still fixed at Q3, Q2, Q1, Q0 as 0, 0, 0, 0. In order to feed in the data and to enable all the flip-flops, we change the clear signal from 0 to 1. Now, it being active low, it is ready to count, and we keep the preset as 1. This ensures that the flip-flop are enabled and they are ready to respond to the changes in the input. The serial data, as we can see from here, the serial data is being fed to the LSB, and we'll see the shifting of the data from LSB towards MSB. We have again the 4 flip-flops. They are F4, F3, F2 and F1, all in master slave mode. Also, all the flip-flops are being triggered at the same time. As we can see that the clock, although it is negative edge triggered, it is fixed directly to all the flip-flops, and hence simultaneously all the flip-flops would change state. So the serial data in this case we consider to be as 0101, that is the LSB here is 1. From the configuration here, we always enter the LSB first, and then we move towards the MSB. So what happens is we need the clock to change state from 1 to 0. Only then would the data shift. Now, it is important to note that the clock is fed simultaneously to all the flip-flops. So hence, when the first falling edge comes, then the data 1 is shifted into data was already present at the input of the LSB flip-flop, that is flip-flop 1. Now it shifts towards the next flip-flop, and the output here, if we note carefully, the output here of the first flip-flop, flip-flop 1, is fed as the input of the next flip-flop. All the flip-flops are in series, that is the output of the first flip-flop acts as the input of the next flip-flop. Hence, what we have here is that the data shift, as this table shows, that the flip-flop data shifts one state to the next flip-flop. The input, as we can see, is 1010. This is how it is fed into the first flip-flop because our input was 0101. It is important to note that we start feeding in data in a serial manner starting from the LSB. So one needs to be very careful. In this particular example, the data and the way it is fed in are mirror image of one another. That is, or rather I would say, the ones complement one another. Our data is 0101 and the way we feed it is 1010. So it is important to note that after the first clock pulse, the data 1 would shift to the next flip-flop and the next data point just after the LSB, that is 0, is fed to the first one. Therefore, the data after the first clock pulse would be 0010. That is, the first two zeros in Q3 and Q2 are the initial zeros, they are not the data. That's because we would have cleared all the flip-flops and our Q3, Q2, Q1, Q0 outputs were 0000. Let's concentrate again. We are feeding in data 0101 in a serial manner starting from the LSB. That means we should be feeding in 1 or making available data 1 at the input of the first flip-flop F1. Hence, after the first clock pulse, we would have the output of F1 as 1. The 0 that was present over there due to clearing of all the flip-flops moves to the output of the next flip-flop, that is Q1. The output of Q1 moves to Q2 and the output of Q2 moves to Q3. That is, this happens after the first clock pulse. Hence, in parallel manner, if we look at our axis, the outputs of all the flip-flops, we have our Q3, Q2, Q1, Q0 as 0001, wherein the 000 are not data but rather the outputs whence we had cleared the data. Now, at the second clock pulse, the output of the first flip-flop F1 moves to the output of the second flip-flop F2. Hence, in serial mode, we would get, or rather parallel mode, we would get the data as 0100, wherein, or rather, if you look at it the other way, we will have Q3, Q2, Q1, Q0 as 0010. Now, the first two zeros are from the clearing of the flip-flops, they are not the data. However, 1, which was in flip-flop 1, is now seen as the output of flip-flop 2, and the 0 in the output of flip-flop 1 is also the data. So, in a serial mode, we have been able to shift 1 and 0 as the outputs of the first two flip-flops. At the third clock pulse, we would again have the data 1. Now, this 1 would appear at the output of the flip-flop 1, 0, which was available at the output of flip-flop, the first flip-flop would come as the output of the second flip-flop, that is F2, and the output of F2, which was 1, has now moved to the output of the third flip-flop, that is F3, whereas the fourth flip-flop would still show 0. Fourth output of the fourth flip-flop would still be 0. Hence, looking at it parallelly, we would have Q3, Q2, Q1, Q0 as 0, 1, 0, 1. Now, the first 0 at Q4 is still the 0, it is not the data, it is still a 0 that we obtained when clearing the flip-flops, whereas outputs of Q2, Q1, Q0, which would be 101, are the data. At the fourth clock pulse, the last 0 comes in as the output of flip-flop 1. The 1 which was there at the output of F1 now moves to output of F2. The 0, data 0, which was there at the output of F2 now goes as output of F3, and the 1 data 1 which was at the output of F2 now moves to the last flip-flop, that is F3. Hence Q3, Q2, Q1, Q0 are 01, 01. Hence, after the fourth clock pulse, we are able to get the parallel data output from this configuration. Now the question is, what about the serial output? As we can see, thus far we have been able to feed in data in a serial manner. We had the data as 0101, and beginning with the LSB, we have moved towards the MSB. Please note that it was a 4-bit data input that we considered, and hence the use of 4 flip-flops. If we have more data, then we need more flip-flops. If we have less data, we would need less number of flip-flops. Moving forward and looking at the table, it's easy to see that in this case, at the 5th clock pulse, we would have, during the 4th clock pulse, when we had the parallel data, we found that we had the output as 1 for at the LSB. Then at the 5th clock pulse, that one would be lost and we would have the 0. At the 6th clock pulse, we would have the 1, and finally at the 7th clock pulse, we would see that we get the 0. Hence, our data 0101 is obtained as the output in a serial manner. In both the cases, we have fed in the data in serial as serial input. However, while accessing the data, we have seen that it is used in either a parallel manner, which is SIPO, or as the output is accessed in serial manner, hence it makes it SISO. It is easy to understand that for parallel access, we require, in the case of SIPO, we require only 4 clock pulses, whereas for CISO, we require 7 clock pulses. So, it is a no-brainer that we understand that, of course, SIPO is faster than CISO. However, since while accessing a data, we would need to access 4 bits in the case of SIPO, whereas we need to access only 1 bit at a point of time for CISO. So, SIPO requires more electrical circuitry compared to CISO. This simply means that CISO configuration would be cheaper, would consume less electricity, would be easier to fabricate compared to SIPO. But when we require a faster access, in that case we would need SIPO compared to CISO. It would be easier to design a CISO, but faster processing would require SIPO. So, if we again go back to the circuit, we see that it is easy to understand that at a given point of time, we can access the data either in a parallel manner or in a serial manner. So, serial shifting takes or requires 7 clock pulses, and since we understand that each clock pulse requires a finite amount of time, hence CISO would always be slower than SIPO. In this case, the thing to note is, what we must appreciate is that we are processing only 4 bits of data. Now, when we require, or rather we are downloading a movie, typically at a low resolution, a minimum space required would be of the order of 700 MB. That is 700 into 10 is megabyte. So 700 into 1024 into 1024 into 8. Now this would be a huge number. So even if there is a gap of only 3 clock cycles between serial output and parallel output, serial output takes 7 clock cycles, serial output takes 7 clock cycles, and parallel output takes only 4 clock cycles. But when we are considering such huge numbers like 1024 into 1024 into 700 into 8, at that point of time, even a nanosecond, a difference of a couple of nanoseconds would make a difference, because the components in use in digital terminology and digital circuits is huge. Hence, what we would suggest is that depending on the price, depending on the applications, CPO is faster, although CPO would require a bit more number of circuit elements, it would be costlier compared to CISO. So in this case, again, the master-slave flip-flops have been used because there might occur a race around condition between the stages. At the rising edge of the clock, the master would change the state in accordance with the inputs, whereas when the second clock arrives, the other flip-flops would change. A case in point, when the second clock arrives, F3 will change, which is the master state, in accordance with Q2 or Q1, and the information is transmitted to F3. And at the same time, in Q1, that is the slave, the change would take place at the trailing edge of the clock, while the information is already transferred at the rising edge. This way, we are able to prevent the race around condition. Now, the thing to concentrate here is that we have the same circuit, if we compare, for which we use the CISO and the CPO. We have the same circuit here, but in this case, we have used a NAND gate instead at the preset point. We find that we have certain data, and that data can be transferred into the flip-flops directly. Now, this circuit is the circuit for universal shift register, and this allows us to perform all the 4 functions, that is CISO, CPO, PISO and PIPO. When all clear is 0, the preset is 1, that is preset enable is 0 since it is active low. Then at that point, Q3, Q2, Q1, Q0 are all 0, 0, 0, 0, and the flip-flop is said to be reset. We take a small break, and when we come, we describe the function of this universal shift register. Thank you.